Welcome to the Healing for Male Survivors podcast. This is a podcast for male survivors of sexual abuse and assault, whether as a child or as an adult. Know that you are not alone and the abuse was not your fault. My name is Mike Chapman. I'm a certified recovery life coach and also a survivor. Let's find hope and healing together. With me today is Kevin Bolger joining us on week 2 of Tuesday Night Live, which is our live podcast events, which are every Tuesday night. We have 7:30 p.m. to 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We have these live podcast events. And if you want to learn more about joining us live or being a guest yourself, love to have you. More information is at polarlifeconsulting.com/live. And our schedule of upcoming speakers is there as well. And so to begin, I'd like to welcome Kevin Bolger. And Kevin is a co-host of the podcast called No Longer Ashamed, available at any podcast near you, all the podcast providers. And they're special to me because that was the first place I told my story on a podcast, was on their podcast. And I was actually their first guest
Yes.
to share their story. That they invited people to come, but I was the first one who was bold enough to come. And I am so thrilled that Kevin has returned the favor and is one of my first guests on here. And so I would like to turn the tables and let Kevin share his story. And if you're interested, I'll have the links in the show notes of his podcast and my first episode on there, which I believe was episode 10. And this was 3 years ago.
Episode
So
10.
things are
Yes.
changed. Yes. And see what you've done. See what you've
Just
done. Now I'm
over
doing my own
3 years ago.
podcast. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yes.
You
Um,
and Doug Carpenter has been one of our
yep.
guests, and we've
Yep.
had panels with
Yeah,
both of
we've been
you.
on several episodes, yes.
Yes.
And I will post those as well. But it's a great podcast. I definitely subscribe.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, I love the work that you and Laurie do on that. And both are survivors, and they got this wonderful podcast. And so, Kevin, I want to get to know you better and my audience to get to know you better. So, we're going to do 4 questions. Now it's time for 4 questions, that part of the podcast when we get to know our guest a bit better by asking a few questions. Let's go. So, Kevin, 4 questions. First question, what is your favorite food memory?
Well, there's so many, and I think most of my favorite food memories come from my wife. She's an amazing cook, and she's always been able to make something amazing out of whatever we just have on hand. But I think my most memorable is some of the times we've been out, and one time we went to San Diego and we had a just amazing meal while we were there, and it was um, just I think the festivity of being out somewhere I'd never been before, and spending time just together and splurging on ourselves. It was an amazing evening together. And the food was fantastic, but it was mostly just the time together that I remember being so memorable.
Right, that's wonderful. And I've
But
seen you two together, and yeah, you're a great couple. It's fun to see you guys interact.
20 years.
Wow, that's great. Yes, I was surprised. Food memory was an Eastern Carolina barbecue because he and
I was
Charnell visited
going.
East
I was
Coast. They were
going
visiting
to.
family, and we were able to meet up with my wife as well, and the 4 of us took them out to a Eastern Carolina barbecue, which is definitely a treat. So that
Uh,
was a good memory for me. But
that was a good memory.
yeah, that was
I
fun.
was going to drop
Um,
that one as well, but I want to highlight the time I
Of
spent with my wife. That
course,
was
of
so good.
course. Yes. Next question. What is your favorite Christmas or holiday memory?
So when I was growing up, my favorite holiday was Halloween. And I think, when you interviewed Kenneth about his superhero and you talked about going to the conventions and
Huh?
dressing up and where you would get attention for, you know, being this in this costume and so forth. When I was growing up, I was always kind of the kid that hung in the back and tried not to get noticed, but I always would plan some elaborate Halloween costume. And we lived in a neighborhood where we would roam the neighborhood for hours at Halloween and hit every house and go to several houses, you know, several times because they had the most candy or the most decorations. And just
Right.
I think being able to dress up as someone else, and it made me feel like I was something special, and that was really important to me back then. And so I just remember when I became a teenager and we didn't do Halloween so much anymore, I was really sad and missed that. It was something very special when I was growing up. But
Yeah.
I think my favorite Christmas memory was the first time I saw the Peanuts movie, the Charlie Brown Christmas.
Uh,
And that memory is also tied in with my favorite Bible scripture, to tell you the
uh,
truth. So
uh-huh.
I'll tie that in when we come to that question.
Okay. So what about the Charlie Brown Christmas? What drew you to that? Was there a character in there that you could relate to most, or
Yes, Charlie Brown, of course.
right?
I always felt
Yeah.
very wishy-washy growing up, and
Yeah.
like I wasn't ever able to get anything, do anything special. But
Mm,
what struck me the most about that movie was when Linus, when Charlie cries out, "Doesn't anybody know what Christmas is really about?" And Linus goes on stage and reads Luke 2.
mm.
And that was my introduction to the Bible when I was young,
Oh,
because I did
wow.
not grow up going to church,
Right.
learning anything about the Bible. And when I first saw that, I realized that's what Christmas was all about. And it just struck me that was the real important thing about Christmas was that's the day Christ was born. It wasn't about Santa Claus and presents. It wasn't about Christmas trees. It was about Christ being born. And that
Mm.
was my introduction to the Bible when I was young.
Oh, wow. Love that.
And to
Yeah.
this day, that's still my favorite Bible, I think, verse is
Yeah.
Luke 2 when
Yeah.
it
And you can do a
just
chapter. I have a whole section that I use for my favorite too. So,
yeah, I
uh,
have a lot of favorites, but
that
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 one,
is one of my favorites as well. Is Luke 2. I do love that.
yeah.
Especially
It,
because towards the end of the chapter, where Jesus is a little older, and I think that's when he goes to the temple and so forth. And it's like
mhm,
parents are freaking out. It's like, of course, I'm going to be in my father's house. So
yeah,
that's towards the end of chapter 2. So all that Jesus is growing up years.
all of Luke
Uh,
2, but yeah,
yeah,
that one scripture where it describes the shepherds and the angels, it just brings a sense of awe to the actual birth of Christ, which is the birth of our Lord in this
exactly.
world. And I've always held that sense of awe since,
Mm.
first hearing Linus speaking it and then actually reading it. Every time I read it, it still strikes me.
Right, right. Okay, and let's see. Well, you've hit number 4, so we'll go back to number 3. What is your favorite church memory?
Oh, yeah. Favorite church memory? Well, there's a few. Um, One of them is when my pastor asked me to narrate at the Christmas program. And I have never liked being on stage or in front
Mhm.
of people. I have terrible stage fright. And I said, no way. And he said, well, you can read it from the sound booth and no one will be watching you. You'll just be narrating it on a microphone. And so I did it, and it was great. It was amazing. I'd never done anything like that before. I'd never been on mic, never been on stage. I avoided it much as I could, but it was
Right.
really fun. And especially to hear my voice in the whole church, and no one knew it was me except for a few people, and it was really fun. But I think my absolute favorite moment was when I told my testimony in church. That same
Wow.
pastor asked me to tell my testimony. Well, actually, it
Mhm.
was a different pastor. It was the pastor that followed him. And he really encouraged me because when we became members, we told the elders and the pastor our testimony, and he really thought that sharing my testimony could help others. He knew that there were others in the congregation that had been through abuse and had
Right.
struggled with that. And to hear my message of hope and healing and how God had worked through me and brought me healing, he thought that could be really helpful to others in the congregation. So, in spite of having terrible stage fright and literally sweating, I told my testimony, and I think it was actually in many ways the beginning of my podcast, or the podcast
Hmm.
that we do,
Right. Yeah, I know.
because
That's how I
from
felt when I was on your podcast, because that was the first time sharing it. It's like, and I had given it just reading it because for like Celebrate Recovery, and that's what they do when you share your testimony. It's all written out, pre-approved, and you don't stray from the script. So you're basically just up there reading. I guess it's a quality control thing. Um, and so I had all that ready, and then you kept asking me questions like, "Wait, that's 5 pages away," and what do I do? And I was so not used to it. Yeah, I was so nervous, and yeah. But it gets easier the more you do it for sure. And now look what I'm doing. I'm hosting. So
yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's definitely a journey, but doesn't take long. You get used to it just like any skill. And yeah, and now look at you. Yeah, you
Well,
do great.
and I think we have found. I mean, we've had over 20 guests now. I think it's pushing 30, and we have found for so many guests, it's one thing to share your story with someone you know and you care about and you trust and so forth, but to actually speak it out loud
Mhm.
where it's broadcast is
Right.
it can be life changing because and I think in some ways when we tell our story we're fixing it in place, which is in the past, and then we're
Yes.
also talking about our journey as far as after what happened, how we dealt with it, and how we're dealing with it now, and our journey of healing. And so by telling your story out loud, you're kind of fixing it in a place which is in the past. So many people that struggle with PTSD and so forth and have, flashbacks, which I had, and night terrors,
Ditto.
which I had, and
Ditto.
it's part of not when you're not it's not in the past anymore. It feels like it's not completely past you. So sometimes these things come up and it feels like it's real, like it's still happening. But I think part of telling your story is putting it back in that place, which was in the past, and moving on from it. And I think for many of our guests, that's been a big part of their journey is to put it in the past and to move on. And we've had several guests that have written books. Our latest guest, she just finished her book, and so we interviewed her after it was
Okay.
published. She just published it, and I think it's a major part of healing is to locate what happened to you in the past and being able to move on.
Right. Yeah, I love how you put that, that sharing your story ties it to the past instead of the present. And I
Mhm.
know sharing it uh, is was such a huge healing milestone for me. Just getting my story out, and the more I shared it, the more healing I had. I think because it gets rid of the shame and the guilt because you're saying it out loud, and no one's attacking you. No one's saying, "Oh, that's horrible. You shared that." It's so freeing. The world didn't end. The sun came up the next
Mhm.
day,
Yes.
and it's okay. And then it's like, oh, and you just feel this lightness, this release coming after sharing. But I like how you put it, that it's kind of it kind of anchors it in the past and then keeps it there. Yeah, it's the you're only as sick as your secrets. That's a common
Mhm.
phrase in recovery houses. And that's true that if you can get it out in the open somehow, even just telling one other person, doesn't necessarily have to be a podcast, but getting it out helps so much to alleviate the shame for sure.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
And I
that's a
even
beautiful way
like
of putting that. Uh-huh.
we recommend if you don't have anyone you feel safe you could share with to journal about it.
Yes.
And one of the resources I love is the Male Survivor website where you can
Yes.
actually write your story. You could do it anonymously if you want. I know you're on there a lot, Mike.
Yes, at
And
least I was. Not so much
yeah,
these days because of my own stuff going
yeah,
on with Polar Life and husband material and so forth. But
yeah,
yes,
that's the
that's I think
same.
I think that's how I found you, was there.
Was through Male
Um,
Survivor, yes.
yeah,
And it's
and
amazing if you want to share your story, but you don't have anyone you feel safe with, or you don't feel like, you're ready to share it with some person, you can put it out there in writing. And I think writing it also gives you that kind of definition so you can put it in its place, which was behind you.
right, yes, definitely. Um, and likewise in Polar Life, we've got our chat room with WhatsApp. That's a great place to share and share your story. And also in the husband material community, which is free, they have free options. There is the subgroup that I run for abuse survivors. I believe it, yeah, we're calling it fellowship now. So CSA Survivor Fellowship within Husband Material. So it's only survivors that are in that section, and you can share. And it's all Christian, which is nice. That's one thing about Male
Yeah.
Survivor. Um, they do have a little spirituality subsection, but
Hmm.
overall, talking about faith is not encouraged, except in that area because there's so much church hurt and so much abuse that happened from church leadership or other houses of worship of different religions, that so much abuse has happened in those walls that people are very averse to talking about anything spiritual, sadly. So it's
Yeah.
definitely discouraged in that area. So
Yeah.
I wanted to have alternative ways to
Yeah.
share where people who have a um, more of a faith focused safe place to share.
Uh, that
So,
that is something that we've talked about is so many survivors were abused by someone of faith, someone in the church or so forth,
right,
and so they felt betrayed by their faith. And
right,
we have actually a close friend that that has happened to, and he's always struggled with his faith
Right.
because of it. And so we did do an episode about that because, as you know, Laurie and I are both believers, but we've
Right.
also come through, you know, terrible,
Right.
terrible history, but not necessarily with our faith. It's just it's hard sometimes when you're a survivor to understand, and it feels like, how did God let this happen? And
Right.
that's a struggle
And
because we
that's
know that
another
God.
question that a lot of the survivors say. It's like, why would, if there is a God, why would he let this happen?
Exactly.
And so
And
there's a lot of anger towards God and so forth.
yeah, and so we talked about that because we both, Lori and I, have had those struggles in the past.
Right. Right.
And even though God's done a lot of healing in my life, there were times when I really struggled with that question.
Yeah. And yeah, abuse by clergy or sexual assault by clergy. That's part of my story as well.
Yes. Yeah.
So, um, so yeah, I do understand that, and I definitely had my own questions for a while as well. Um, moving on, I want to know more about Kevin and Kevin's story and what brought you here to this land of getting others to share their story. Because you don't share your story very much, and Doug is the same way. So I wanted to make sure
Yes.
gave Doug a platform to share his story, and I wanted to do the same with you. So Kevin, tell me your story wherever you want to start. I want to know how you got to this place.
Well, it started when I was very young. I don't know exactly how old. I just know I
Hmm.
was very young, and I believe it was my earliest memory was when I was being abused by a family member, an older family member. And that memory has stuck with me my whole life. Unlike some survivors who have repressed memories, or they have very, you know, they don't know if it's a dream, if it was real, especially when you're very young. You don't know if it was reality because at that time your memory's pretty shaky. But I knew it was real, and I knew it was real my whole life, and that led me to kind of be an introvert for a lot of my life when I was young. And I had friends, but I didn't really fit in, so to speak, in a lot of ways. Well, then in junior high, um, there was someone that took an interest in me, and he was older than me, and I felt like, wow. And I had him in a couple classes, and one of them I was doing this artwork in, and he really liked it, and it was pretty good. I mean, I was a good artist back then. I don't do it very much now, but when I put my hand to it, I could be a good artist. And so he took an interest in it, and so we became friends, and I felt special. I felt like, someone had noticed me, and I did, you know, have some form of skills and mattered. But then he invited me home under the pretense, we were 11 or 12. He was probably 13 or 14, but he wanted to show me some of his dirty movies, he called them. And I wasn't really, I was curious, but I just wanted to spend time with him. I just wanted to, continue our friendship and grow in it. But it was actually a setup, and that's when I think you were part of that grooming panel. That's when I realized I was groomed by him and his older sister. She was
Oh, yeah.
high school age, and so he brought me home and she abused me. And I think that actually had more traumatic effect in me, especially because I was older and I understood what was happening. But I didn't recognize that until fairly recently because those memories are still pretty repressed. I remember some of it, but because of the trauma of it, it's still I I don't remember all of it very vividly.
So it sounds like this friend was grooming you so that you could be taken advantage of by his sister and not by
Yes.
him.
Yes, but he was
Oh,
also um, filming it. He was taking
oh,
film
okay.
of it at the time. And
Oh,
so I was very traumatized. I left there. I remember leaving in a panic when I realized he was filming it, and never hung out with him after that. I just stayed away from him after that. But because of that, I became even more shy and more introverted.
right,
And I never felt comfortable around girls after that
right.
because I felt like sex was really dirty. Sex was really bad. It was a bad thing. And
Mm,
so it really basically hampered me until I was a teenager, a young teenager. We moved away from California to Seattle at that time. And I had some friends that introduced me to marijuana. And all of a sudden, I found something that made me feel good. And basically, what it
mm,
did was it suppressed that feeling of shame, of
right.
self hatred, of unworthiness. And
It
I
turned
felt
off the
like,
pain.
yeah,
Yes.
it turned off the pain. And so I ran with it. And from then until my 30s, I just used as much and I experimented with a lot in my teenage years, but it was mostly just marijuana and alcohol. And those worked the best and they worked
Mm,
reliably, so I used them a lot. And one of the problems with that, though, is for me, using marijuana is it removes all my motivation. So I
mm,
had no aspirations, no willpower to do anything. I just took whatever job I could and did
right.
as much as I could to keep it, but that's it. So I settled, and I settled for a long time, just surviving because one of the things I had always felt when I was young was um, you know, because I was used
Yeah,
by the abuse, I felt like I didn't matter. And because I didn't matter, it didn't matter what I did. So I felt like if I wanted to abuse drugs, abuse alcohol, it didn't matter because I didn't matter.
right.
And it wasn't until basically after I got my first marriage ended, after I got divorced, and I started taking my life seriously
Hmm.
and worked on my career to be an electrician and actually, started to have a purpose in my life. Up until then, I really had no purpose other than to survive and whenever possible do as much drugs or alcohol as I could so I didn't
Right,
feel the pain. And
right.
when I actually got a purpose and started, and this was after I so while I was married, it came out that I had been a survivor of abuse, and I had confronted the family members that were involved. We had
Now,
we had
this is your marriage
basically
with Charnel or
no, this was my first marriage,
first marriage?
and it came out, and I confronted my family members. We, you know, I had to set boundaries because I couldn't handle being around that person. I couldn't handle
Mm,
having phone calls from that person. I couldn't go to family events if that person was there. It just
right,
I reacted. I would disassociate and then later on I would pay the price because I was having PTSD and so forth. So I had to set boundaries. And I started going to therapy. And as a result of going to therapy, one of my therapists recommended going to group therapy. She was starting a group with 5 other men, and she asked if I was interested, and I did. And that was, I think, a key point in healing because I began to realize a lot of my issues, a lot of my problems, I wasn't the only one going through that. I wasn't the only one that was dealing with this stuff. I wasn't the only one that felt that way.
Right.
And there is a path out of it. There's a path to healing. There's ways to address those issues, and I started learning those methods of handling things and dealing with them and looking back at my past even though I didn't want to, and helping that lost child inside of me, and protecting that poor kid, and
Right.
giving him the things that he didn't have when he was growing up, because my childhood was basically taken from me. So I tried to give it back to him. And that's when I started healing.
Right.
So that is my story in a nutshell. But the other story is the story of the podcast. And I think that's
Yes.
another very interesting story because, like I said, I always stayed away from being on stage or anything performance related. But
Well,
when
before you go there, I have a couple questions. Whatever happened with the friend who wasn't a friend who actually filmed you? Did you ever follow up with that or find out, does he still have that tape, or did you just assume or didn't
no,
even think about it? Or
no, and I used to have a yearbook from then, but I got rid of a lot of that stuff. And so no, I don't even know anything about them. But I wonder what caused them to go down that path, because obviously they were grooming me,
right,
but what what led them to lead, because he was young too. He wasn't that
right.
old. He was just a year or so older than me. And so I always wonder what was their background? How did that start?
And was somebody else pulling the strings as well?
Yeah, quite
Because chances
possibly.
are what they now called child sexual abuse materials, back then child pornography, um,
Hmm.
it could easily be marketed and sold for money. And if they were doing it for somebody else who was then using it,
Yeah, I
I don't even know if
wonder.
you've ever gone there, but ever thought that it might be out there in, you know, being viewed still to this day, those
Yeah,
things.
quite possibly. I have never researched it or looked for it, so to speak. It's not something
I
I've
know
willing to approach, but yeah,
once I uncovered the fact that I had been trafficked and remember bright lights and realizing, yeah, that crap was probably documented. Um, it was recommended to contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC, and they have a database for victims. If you have a photograph of yourself during that age, they can then, with facial match features and so forth, see if there's any material online with your likeness. Because then it will tie things in and connect and so forth, and they can take it off on your behalf. Um,
mm,
but just saying, if you or any of our listeners ever in that situation where you believe you may have been unwillingly a part of CSAM, child sexual abuse materials, otherwise known as child pornography. Yeah, NCMEC is one way to say. Here's a photo, and I did this. Took about a year to hear back from them, and they did not get any hits for me,
Mm.
thankfully. But they will keep my data on file, so in case something does turn up, they would then be able to let me know. So, um, just FYI, just wanted to throw
Yeah,
that out there.
I'm
Uh,
not sure.
I don't know if
Um,
you've ever even thought about it, and I don't even know if you want to think about it, but if you want to explore that, that is definitely an option. Don't mean to coach you as a coach,
no,
but
it has, since I've recognized that I was groomed and that I was filmed, I kind of wished I didn't throw that yearbook back or away because I thought maybe I can, and I know I can look it up online. Um, as you know, though, it's hard to go back and visit, especially, those times when
yes,
that was a really difficult period because all I wanted was to belong, and
hmm
then to be used in that way by that,
right,
it's painful. It's painful to go back there,
right. But
but
if you
it
ever
is.
want to look into that, that's definitely an option for you, Kevin.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It might be worth doing.
Oh,
Yeah, it's
yeah. So,
it's
moving on, uh, podcasting. How did you get into the world of podcasting?
all began in church. um,
Yes.
it started when I did that Christmas program, and I really enjoyed being on microphone and hearing
Mhm.
myself. And
Yes.
then
And you do
my
have, I know Laurie has mentioned this so many times on the podcast, you have a beautiful sounding voice. The vocal quality is very good and very soothing. The deep baritone quality that you have is yes, it's very nice. You have a very good quality voice for audio. You say, yes, I got a face for radio.
I've got a face
But
for
you do
radio
have a
indeed.
voice for radio for sure.
Well, and that, Lori is a radio professional, and
Yes.
she recognized that as well. The majority of the people who comment on my voice do call it soothing. It's
Mhm.
very soothing.
It
And
is. It
that
is.
is, a quality that's, looked for in certain, but she recommended I go into voiceover, and I told her I have no background in theater or
Uh,
acting or any of that. So she said, "Well, try a podcast. That's a good way to get your foot in the door. Just try doing a podcast." And so I thought about it, and I'm like, who would want to listen to me? What am I going to talk about that anyone would be interested in? And so I prayed about it, and right away I felt like I got an answer from God that this is what I want you to do. And
uh,
my first reaction was, "Are you nuts? Are you?" And I'm like, I don't know if I can do that. And
yeah.
but it was just this persistent, this is what I want you to do. This is what you should do. And so I threw it out there with Lori, and I said we could do this together because I think well, men are underrepresented as far as being survivors and having some sort of resources,
Exactly.
but I think it's really important that, men and women are survivors, and we go through a lot of the same things, but we also have very different perspectives and different issues. And so I wanted to do something that where we could share that and also share those issues and the stigma and all that stuff that we deal with, that men deal with it certain ways and women deal with it other ways, and to explore that. And so I asked her if she wanted to do it with me, and her reaction was very similar. Are you nuts? And then we talked about, and so we started the podcast. And I felt it was really important to allow others to share their story
Right,
because I knew when I had shared my story and my testimony, it was so overwhelming, but it was also so important. And I wanted to give others that avenue of, this is
yes,
a place you can share safely. And you don't have to say your name, or you can, or you can do, but and as you know,
right,
we've had so many people from
yes,
all different. We've had people that have been an author, and we've had people that have never shared their story before.
right.
And
Like me. Ah,
yeah,
yeah.
and so I think it was just, and I still don't do voiceover, even though I've got lots of practice now, and I
Ah,
have a lot of background. I know how to edit and do all that stuff, and
right,
but it's kind of taken a backseat to doing the podcast because I think this has become more important than
yes,
trying to get into voiceover.
right. I know it is such important work that you guys do, and you and I tried to carry this with this podcast as well. You are
Mhm.
so warm and welcoming, you and Lori, and it made it just such a safe place for me to share my story. And yes, you kept interrupting me with a bazillion questions, just like I do as a podcast host, but it was still very, very warm and
Mhm.
safe. And
Thank
for
you.
survivors sharing their story for the first time, that's really important to feel
Yeah.
that because the world just feels so unsafe. And y- you've got a very safe tonality and voice, and Lori as well. It was just, it was very safe. And I'm so glad God brought me to you, and I'm tearing up, but because
Me
yeah, it
too.
was the perfect first place for me to share and allowed me to get over that and then share not only on your podcast several more times, but on other podcasts and other venues as well.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I'm so appreciative of what you did and you and Lori, what you have. And I'm trying to carry that on
Yeah.
as well. Um,
Yeah. I think especially for men, it's so hard to get to that point of being able to say it out loud, to say it out loud to someone, to because it's we're taught to, you know, be strong. We're taught to hide our feelings. We're taught to not show weakness, and being a survivor is looked on as a weakness or being vulnerable, and so we're taught to not show that. But I think it's so important for there to be a safe place without judgment, without uh, any questioning, and without trying to push anything on it. We're not doing it for anything.
right.
We're not trying to sell a book. We're not trying to get you into a program or anything. We just
Hmm.
want you to have a safe place where you can share, or you can just listen and hear other people's stories. And maybe you can hear
Right,
someone's story and you'll go, oh, so I'm not the only one that's been through that. And,
right.
so I think it's become a lot bigger than I thought it would. And it's
Uh,
become more important to me in my healing. I've learned so much from other people's stories and also
right.
from exploring my own story.
Right, definitely. And I want to invite our audience members who have joined us live. If you have questions for Kevin or me, feel free to put that in the Q&A section. And that's one of the joys about being here live. And if you are listening later on the podcast and would like to join us for future live podcast events, you can learn more and get a schedule of upcoming guests at polarlifeconsulting.com/live. And we don't have any questions just yet.
Oh, really?
And
There's a
oh, I do have
question up
one. Yep,
there.
there it
Yeah.
is.
I'll answer it.
And
It's
let's see. This says from one of our audience members, Kevin, how old were you the first time you told your story out loud? And can you think of something that someone was concerned about? Your extreme introversion could have opened a window for you to reveal this sooner.
I
Hmm,
love this question.
yeah.
So I was in my 30s. It would have been early 30s, maybe late 20s when I first, and it was triggered. I told my story because I was triggered. A friend of mine, her sister told her that she had been abused. Well, my friend didn't necessarily believe her because she thought she was just trying to get attention. And so I told my friend, I believe her. And the reason I believe her is I'm also a survivor. And I don't think anyone would talk about it just to get attention. And that's kind of when the damn gate below blew open and it just came flooding out. I'd never told anyone before, never shared with anyone. But because of someone else telling their story, it made me realize that I wasn't alone and I wanted to support that person.
Right.
As
Right.
far as, I had many friends that wondered about why I was so shy. Why didn't they try to get me into theater, to do things, to do performances? I had a friend who loved to do, back then we called it lip syncing. And he did these
Right.
performances. And this was when I was in my early 20s, and he would go to these bars where they would lip sync and they'd all dress up and do all this stuff.
Mm,
And he tried to get me to do it. And I did it once. It was really fun, but I didn't like having people looking at me while I was up on stage.
Ah,
I felt flawed. I don't know how else to
right.
put it. I just felt flawed. And I had friends that tried to reassure me, tried to build me up, but until I did finally share my story when I was I think I was around 29 or 30, um, I just felt like, you know, I was purposeless. I didn't have meaning in my life. I didn't have a purpose and I didn't really matter.
Right. I know
So,
so many of those feelings can come from the abuse, like feeling flawed, feeling dirty, feeling worthless, feeling
Mhm.
useless. Of that so much, even if you don't even realize it consciously, those messages are put in the subconscious because that's how those perpetrators abuse us as if we were just a filthy rag to be tossed to the side. And those messages just take root. And so many survivors just feel that same way.
Yeah.
You feel flawed, you feel worthless for sure.
And
And it's
and
quite difficult to overcome them, but doing like you did and starting to work around it to
yeah.
overcome that and
Yeah,
rewrite your story.
I didn't have like the perpetrator that told me I was flawed or that I
Right.
was be in trouble or anything. I don't know if you remember Nathan's story, but his perpetrator
Hmm.
basically threatened his life and
Right.
his
Right.
family's life. But I didn't have that, but somehow I knew innately. And I think it was because I was treated like an object, like I didn't matter.
Exactly.
And I think especially in junior high when I built up this friendship and built up this trust with someone and they just used me. It just made
Hmm.
me feel like I didn't matter and
Right.
I never would matter. And so that's what I had to overcome.
Right. And overcome you have. Um,
Mostly.
and we'll continue to take questions from our audience as well. So if you have additional questions, if you want us to say your name with your question, type that in with your question. Otherwise, we'll just say audience member, like we did with this last question. Uh, you are now what with repeat episodes, because I know you had audio difficulties with some of the earlier episodes, and you've edited those and reposted that. Officially, you have over 100 episodes, but I know some of those are repeats. So out
Yeah,
of all of those episodes, bravo, by the way. Um,
thank you.
do you have any favorite episodes that stand out that you really enjoyed or you really were proud of, or you really felt, wow, that was just a powerful message or a wonderful get as a someone to interview or uh, yeah, what anything stand out?
Well, of course, you're one of my favorites because you were our first,
Oh,
and it was so exciting for us to have a guest. We've had so many guests that I'm just so proud of what they do when they share and what they've done since then. We've had several guests that are Nathan Spiteri is working on those documentaries
right,
and
right,
movie. I mean, he's doing phenomenal stuff. His TED Talk is incredible. I don't know if you've seen it, Mike, but you
yes,
need to see his TED Talk. It just blew my mind when I saw it. It was amazing.
right,
And but you know, almost every guest is my favorite guest. And every time we do a show, I feel like, wow, especially when we have a guest on. But
mm,
oftentimes, Laurie and I we'll just come up, we'll throw a topic out there. I've
right,
had this in my heart, and I already have several for the next couple of weeks because just thinking about, during the week and things come up or you read something in the paper and it's like, oh, I want to talk about this. Um, I think one of the earliest episodes we did, which was on shame, was one of my prouder episodes at that time, and it still
mm,
is because it's
right,
such an important topic, especially for men, but
right,
for all
for sure,
survivors.
yes,
And I think we can't talk about that enough. The shame is what holds us down. It's what
yes.
keeps us from talking about. It's what keeps us from wanting anyone to know what happened to us. And that's why we named our podcast No Longer Ashamed.
Mhm.
I think
Yes.
the shame is one of the hardest things to overcome, but also one of the most important to
Right.
overcome.
Right.
And I think that's one we want to revisit as well because it's just so important to talk about.
Right. Right. Now, your logo, you've got the fire salamander, and you've talked about this in your intro of each episode, um,
Yes,
that it can come out of the fire and still survive. Um, who came up with that? Because it's a great logo, and
that
I love
was
the
me.
backstory to it. So,
That
how
was
did you come up
me.
with that?
Well, when I was first addressing being a survivor, coming out,
Mm,
addressing my family, telling friends, dealing with therapy, going to group therapy, I wanted to do something to symbolize this.
mhm.
And I've always, you know, I've always been uh, one of those kids that would collect snakes or lizards or
Right.
salamanders, or,
Uh-huh.
I always
Yeah.
had critters in my room when I was growing up, and I love salamanders. And there's this myth around fire salamanders that they can actually live through fire. And
Uh-huh.
there's also some that said they could bring fire. They can bring the fire
Possibly with
down.
secretions or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, that
but
that would make
um
sense.
salamanders do sometimes survive fires. They often do when
Right,
they're hibernating in a log
right,
or underground. They hibernate in the mud or they hibernate in rotted wood and so forth. So often after a fire, when the rains come, the salamanders come up. And so that kind of ties into the myth that they survived the fire. Well,
Right.
I felt like I had been through fire. I had been through fire, survived it, and I wanted to show something that I had survived the fire. So I wanted to get a tattoo of a fire
Oh.
salamander with
Uh-huh.
fire and
Uh-huh.
smoke, but I didn't.
You haven't done it yet.
No, I haven't. And,
Well, you made it your
um,
podcast logo. Yeah, I'm ink
so
free.
it's now
Eventually,
my
I might get
logo.
some ink, but yeah.
I have never gotten ink, and I think partly it's because of my father. He
Uh-huh.
was in the Navy in World War II, and he got
Uh-huh.
ink back then. He had a
Uh-huh.
Bugs Bunny on one arm and his wings. He was in the naval aviation. He was an aircraft
Uh-huh.
mechanic. So he had his wings on one arm and Bugs Bunny on the other arm. Well, by the
Oh.
time I was, when he came back, he left my family when I was
Mm.
not quite 4 years old. He just left. And then he came back when I was like 13. Well, at
Uh-huh.
that time, his ink looked like splotches.
Right.
And I felt
Yeah, a
like,
lot of those are faded.
I
Yeah.
could get a tattoo now, but in 20 years, it's going to look like
So,
that. I don't want
yeah.
that on me. So I just never did get it, but it's never too late. You can,
No,
you don't have, there's no age limit to getting a tattoo. So I might
even at
one
our
day do
age.
that.
Yeah.
There's another one I want to do, and it was, I saw it at a party. It was a Halloween party, my favorite. And this girl had, you know, those tribal tattoos where they have like barbed wire wrapped around their
Oh, right.
arm
Yeah.
or some sort of, thing
Right.
wrap around. Well, she had the
Hmm.
Who's from Whoville already on her
Oh,
arm, all linked together like they do when they're standing there singing. And I loved
Bahugore,
it when I saw it.
Bahugore. Yes.
I thought, "Oh, that is so special." And it's also kind of a slap in the face of all these macho guys that get these,
Right.
tribal
Right.
tattoos and look tough. I wanted to get the
Right.
Who's from Whoville, and
Yeah.
I
Oh, that's.
might still do that one as well. You never
I
know.
love that. Yes. We've got another question. Um, I'm going to project it on here so it goes on our screen. Are you able to get away, or do you want to get away from being known as the guy who talks about abuse, who has been abused, where everyone at church and in your family and community sees you through that lens? So, yeah, do you ever feel like you get typecast as that guy? Um, oh, that's the guy. Oh, yeah, he just talks about the fact that he's abused. Why can't he just get over it? He's always talking about it. Do you
You
get
know, it I was afraid of that when I first did my testimony in church. I didn't want to be looked at as that guy.
right?
And everyone in the congregation was so warm and accepting and
Mm-hmm.
so comforting. One of the things I was afraid of, I did Sunday school with the kids, and I was afraid some of the parents might not want, someone who's a known sex abuse survivor watching their kids
Right.
because there is that stigma.
Right.
They
That
assume if
that
you're a
survivors could
survivor,
be
you're going to be a
a perpetrator.
perpetrator.
Yeah.
That
Exactly.
stigma still exists, and I was afraid
Yeah.
that might, be an issue. And I
So
told my pastor,
statistics, it's the opposite. Out of all those who are
yeah,
abused, a very, very, very small percentage go
yes,
on to abuse others.
yeah. But there is that statistic and I mean, the stigma, and that stigma is there for a reason.
Right.
Generally, when you hear well, not so much anymore, but back when we were younger, when you heard
Right.
about men who were survivors, it was because they were a perpetrator, because they had done some horrible thing, and then
Right.
they highlighted, oh, he had a horrible childhood, he was abused, and so of course he did this.
Right.
And so
Right.
that stigma stuck around because no other men who were survivors would ever talk about it. As far as do I want to get away from being known as the guy who talks about it? It's not been an issue. I
Mm,
think my wife almost talks about it as much as I do. She's very um flip about sometimes because she wants to share our podcast with people. She wants to talk
right.
about with people. And so she'll just go right into it and talk about it. And sometimes I'm a little like, whoa, okay, I guess we're going to do
Yeah.
this now.
Yeah.
But it,
God has her in your life for a reason.
yes,
She
he
compliments
does.
you quite well because she
But
is
I think
not the quiet, shy type for sure.
what I would like to say about this is no, I don't want to get away from it. It's not an issue. And frankly, I think once you start talking about it, you realize most people are very understanding and are also
Mm,
they want to be helpful if they can, or
right.
comforting in some way, or just, not put you down or label you.
Right.
I know
Right.
there's guys at work that know, and I work in construction, I work in the trades, and there's guys at work that know I do this podcast, that I'm a survivor. They don't belittle me. They don't,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
drag me down about it. They don't treat me differently. That was probably my biggest fear when I first started talking about was that people would treat me differently. And I was afraid that all of a sudden people would treat me different because of that. And that
Right.
hasn't happened. And I think it's really important to talk about that because that's a really big fear I had. And I know for many men, that's probably a fear they have when they talk about with their spouse or with their family, that they're going to be different now, or people will
Mm,
treat them differently. And it can happen, I'm sure. I'm sure there's, I know when you do talk about it, there usually is, it affects your dynamics, your family
right.
dynamics, your relational dynamics. It does affect them, but it wasn't really negative in my life, and it still hasn't been. And so I don't want to say it's never an issue, but I want people to know that it's not that big an issue. And
Right.
I also, though, will say that yes, it will affect your family dynamics. It does have an effect, but generally for me, it hasn't been negative. I know for Lori, it has been very negative. It's been
Right.
very negative in her family, but that's because there was a lot of denial in her family and so forth.
Mm, right.
So it can go either way. Yes.
Right. Yeah. It's a great question.
Yeah,
Um,
I love that question.
yeah, thank you, audience member. And so to wrap things up, where can we reach you? I know that your podcast, No Longer Ashamed, is on all the different podcast services out there.
Yes.
And I'm episode 10. And I'll have links in the show notes.
Well, and
Anything else?
he's also guest on several of our panels. So
Yes,
he's
yes.
you've been on at least 3 or 4
Four,
times, Mike.
yeah, at least.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're one
yeah.
of our faves for sure.
Yep, yep. I think maybe
We
five.
call
I don't
him
know.
we call him
Yes.
Santa Mike.
Yep, that's right. Yes, I remember
Yes.
the episode, and I teased Lori. She was this is before, because my first time I went on, I didn't mention the whole Santa thing, and then she goes on that she was on she's single, and she was on some dating site, and
Oh
there was someone who
yes.
I don't know if he just looked like Santa or was a Santa, but then she had this whole rip about it's like I don't know, do I really want to date a Santa? And then I go in and it's like you realize I'm actually also a Santa, and she had no idea. So we had a big laugh
That was
about that.
hilarious. Yeah.
She was kind of dissing this fact that would she ever consider dating a Santa? Oh my goodness! But then she realized, oh gosh,
Oh,
well yes,
I guess I didn't
Mike's also a
mean to
Santa, and
say
she didn't know
that
that at that
out
time.
loud.
Yes,
That was
I
funny.
know. Yes,
So
it's like,
yes,
oh
we
my
are
gosh.
on
Yes,
pretty much every platform. We and
yes.
but we also have a Facebook page. I would love to have anyone join. As you know, we have a Facebook Messenger group that we keep in touch with some of the guests we've had on, and we kind of preview when we want to do a panel. But yeah, you can contact us on that. And we also have a website, nolongerashamed.org. So you
Yes.
can contact us through that as well. And we would
Wonderful.
love to hear your story. If you want to share your story, we would love to have you on. If you have questions for us, we would love to hear from you. It's been a big deal. And again, like I said, we're not doing this. We don't have an agenda other than we want to share. We want the word to get out. Just like Nathan's saying, we need to talk about this. No one wants to talk about it, but this is important.
It
It's
it needs to get out there. The more people, especially men, the more men share their stories, the more freedom other men feel that they can then share their story, their truth, and it just spreads like wildfire. It snowballs, and that's what we want. Um,
that's
to
why we're doing this. Is
Yes,
to
exactly. Give men the freedom to share their story and get out of the shame and the guilt that they so wrongly, but still often feel from the abuse. And it's such a great way to jumpstart the healing process for sure.
Yeah, I think the only way we can change the stigma around childhood sexual abuse, especially for men, is for more men to talk about, more men to share their stories, more men to make it known that, hey, you know, the stigma, the stuff that was said about, that was back before people realized how many men are survivors, how many men have been abused, because back then they didn't think there were that many men that were abused, and now we're starting to realize that it's huge. It's a big problem.
Yes.
It's not just the Catholic Church. It's not just the Boy Scouts. It's not just,
Yes.
it's everyone.
And
And
they think the 1 in 6 statistic is actually on the low end. It's probably even much more than that,
well, it's
and more
so
closer to the 1 in
underreported.
4 for females. It's actually closer to that, as many theorize, because boys don't tell. So the
Boys don't
stats are
tell.
always underreported.
And that's
So
one of the ways perpetrators got away with it is they knew boys don't tell. So they would take
exactly.
advantage of that. And that's what we want to change. We want to make it so that people will talk about and people will be aware of it.
Yes. Yes. And thank you so much for all you do. And thank you so much for being with us tonight,
Such a joy to
Kevin.
see you. It always is.
If you would like to learn more about my coaching with Polar Live Consulting, where I provide one-on-one coaching and group coaching, both with a focus on healing for male survivors, reach out to me at polarliveconsulting.com. That is Polar spelled Polar. I would love to hear from you. I want to hear your story. If you would like your story featured on this podcast, contact me via my website. If you like this podcast, please rate and review, because that's how other people can find me, and I really want to spread this message of healing and hope to others. And remember, you are not alone. Healing is possible, and the abuse was not your fault. Let me repeat that. The abuse was not your fault. See you next time on the Healing for Male Survivors podcast.